民主, democracy, 自由, freedom, 改革, reform. In the spring of 1989, protesters at Tiananmen Square began a revolution, or as the government called it, a counter-revolution, demanding these three things. Resisting the people's calls for democracy, freedom, and reform, the Chinese Communist Party violently massacred thousands of protesters. 36 years later, the Tiananmen Revolution is still being fought, in China and around the world, as Western nations continue to be willfully ignorant of the immorality of the Chinese government, and censorship stifles the voices of China's people. The legacy of the Tiananmen protests remains crucial. The protests showed the power of the people, and the government's bloody reaction showed just how far an oppressive government was willing to go to maintain control. From April to June of 1989, hundreds of thousands of students and civilians gathered in Tiananmen Square in a revolutionary attempt to pursue political freedoms in a time of economic reform. Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese Communist Party reacted with violence by sending in the military. The massacre brutally ended the protests and the Chinese people's hopes for political reform, as censorship of the protests has continued to this day, though many try to bring the actions of the protesters to the light. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, first rose to power in 1949 when it defeated the ruling Nationalist Party in the Chinese Civil War. By 1958, the CCP's leader, Mao Zedong, attempted to rapidly industrialize the country in the Great Leap Forward, an economic failure which ultimately led to extreme famine. Mao then began the Cultural Revolution in 1966, an attempt to destroy China's cultural tradition and eliminate the concept of social class by imprisoning intellectuals, purging party leaders, and keeping a tight fist around the private lives of citizens. After the Cultural Revolution and the death of Mao in 1976, Deng Xiaoping, a formerly purged CCP leader and opponent of the Cultural Revolution, became the paramount leader of China in 1978. Shortly after his rise to power, Deng Xiaoping reacted to the failure of the Cultural Revolution by establishing the open door policy, which opened up China to Western economies and pushed for an expansion in education and a decline in poverty. Despite this, most people continued to struggle economically. As education increased, however, a larger number of the Chinese public began to consider and debate new schools of political thought, and many, especially young people, began to rethink their single-party society and desire a democracy. At the same time, the Soviet Union, under Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership, began to implement perestroika, free market reforms which decentralized the economy, as well as glasnost, which allowed open discussion of political and social issues, expanding political freedoms and reducing the power of the Communist Party. Many in China and abroad believed that China would mirror the Soviet Union through democratization and the so-called Gorbachev effect. The primary catalyst for the Tiananmen protests was the death by natural causes of Hu Yaobang, a reformist leader who had been removed from his position as General Secretary of the CCP in 1987, because he supported implementing liberal, Western, free market reforms to the Chinese economy. Many reformist intellectuals, including university students in Beijing, believed that Hu Yaobang represented the hope for China's future and dreams of reform, and that he would return to party leadership to replace Deng Xiaoping. As Zhao Ziyang, another reformist leader, said in his eulogy at Hu Yaobang's funeral, "We should all learn from his strong sense of revolutionary obligation. Over the past 2 years, he demonstrated a wholehearted concern for reform and modernization." Protests began just hours after the death of Hu Yaobang on April 15, 1989, as university students from throughout Beijing gathered in mourning. The protests memorialized Hu Yaobang and the reformist ideas which he stood for, including political freedom and democratization. These protests were revolutionary because they brought up issues and political ideas that had not been discussed to such a massive extent since the rise of communist China. On April 19th, 5,000 students from various Beijing universities marched to Tiananmen Square, where they remained for nearly 2 months. Related protests soon emerged in other Chinese cities, such as Shanghai, Nanjing, Xi'an, Changsha, and Chengdu. The revolutionaries continued to grow in number, especially after Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev visited Beijing on May 15th. The students exhibited their revolution in many ways. For example, they constructed a 27-foot-tall statue called the Goddess of Democracy, threw eggs mixed with paint at the image of Mao in the square, and conducted hunger strikes. Li Peng, the premier of China, declared martial law on May 20th because the students' hunger strikes, what the CCP called bourgeois liberalism, were causing turmoil and gaining support from around China and internationally. After the declaration of martial law, many blue-collar workers, called thugs, joined the revolution in order to protect the students. The CCP feared the growing support for the pro-democracy movement and reacted to it with extreme violence. The People's Liberation Army began to surround Beijing in late May. At first, it seemed as though the army was only there to threaten, not attack the protesters. In fact, some soldiers joined the protesters in solidarity. But then, on June 3rd, announcements were made about a violent suppression that would occur in Tiananmen Square that night. Despite these warnings, the protesters remained. Between June 3rd and 5th, 1989, the People's Liberation Army massacred an unknown number of protesters, including children as young as 9. British students who were in Beijing during the massacre described what they witnessed. "We saw the troops run in, thousands, firing volleys wildly, bullets smashing the hotel windows, then the tanks driving into the crowds below. And still the people stayed on the street, defiant, outraged." Western journalists, who had been in Beijing for the Gorbachev visit, documented the protests from the beginning and inspired the world with the Chinese quest for democracy. During the massacre, the Western press focused especially on, and garnered a worldwide reaction to, a solitary man dubbed Tank Man, who famously blocked the path of a line of tanks as they exited the square, and whose identity and fate remains unknown. But Tank Man was just one of up to 1 million protesters who experienced tragedy while fighting for freedom. While most of the students managed to escape after the massacre began, the so-called thugs stayed to stand off against the military and were subsequently imprisoned. Many were put on death row and executed. Most were sent to Laogai, or reformed through labor prisons, which were modeled after Soviet gulags. Prisoners faced abusive conditions in the Laogai, and many struggled financially and with their health after being released. To this day, they are isolated and surveilled by the government. The blue-collar workers who supported the students are often excluded from the historical memory of the protests, despite being the ones who oftentimes suffered the most, because they were seen as less educated on the political goals of the protests. Immediately after the massacre, the Chinese government began spreading false statements about the nature of the Tiananmen incident by underestimating the number of civilian deaths and blaming the deaths on the protesters. In a speech on June 9, 1989, just days after the massacre, Deng Xiaoping said of the protesters, "What we faced was not just some ordinary people who were misguided, but also a rebellious clique, and a large quantity of the dregs of society." Western nations immediately reacted to the massacre by speaking out against China's actions and suspending military and government interactions with China. Since 1989, China's economy has rapidly grown, as Western nations have since removed their economic sanctions, willfully ignoring the immorality of the Chinese government, to build factories and capitalize off cheap Chinese labor. With modernized cities and a booming economy, China is seemingly perfect from the outside, but beneath the surface exists environmental destruction, a lack of human rights, and a continued absence of an open society. The one-party system remains, and Xi Jinping, China's current president, is determinedly anti-reform. Since 1989, censorship has hidden the truth of Tiananmen Square. The Tiananmen Mothers are a group of family members of victims of the massacre, who document and memorialize those killed. Today, former Tiananmen protesters and members of the Tiananmen Mothers continue to experience internet and camera police surveillance. Despite the continued censorship and denial of rights, many in China still express hope for a democratic future for their nation. In the years since 1989, reformers have reacted to the massacre by risking their lives to smuggle out secret documents, such as the Tiananmen Papers, which detailed the classified actions of China's leaders in 1989, which have brought continued attention to the protests and massacre. As Zhang Maosheng, a Tiananmen protester, said, "That mighty man Deng Xiaoping, didn't we survive him? Me? Well, I'm not even 40 yet. I'll live to see the day when the people of June 4th are politically rehabilitated." The Tiananmen protesters' fight for reform continues today in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and worldwide. Despite the Chinese government's violent reaction, the revolution at Tiananmen Square showed the power of the people to resist oppression.